Meltdowns are not the same as tantrums. Meltdowns are far more intense, they go on longer, and they can happen at any age, so they're not just something to do with the terrible twos. But the most important thing is that meltdowns don't tend to respond to traditional parenting strategies. In fact, they can actually make them worse. Today, I'm taking on the challenge of calming the chaos of meltdowns and finding peace in the madness. Welcome to the Zen Parent Survival Guide podcast. I'm your host, Esther Freeman, and I teach parents the principles and techniques for how my daughter went from 5 or 6 violent meltdowns a day to virtually zero. In this weekly podcast, you'll learn how to create a calmer family life. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Meltdowns can leave a parent feeling very vulnerable, very emotionally vulnerable, very isolated. I know because I went through this with my own daughter. She would have 5 or 6 violent meltdowns a day, each lasting maybe up to half an hour. And whatever I tried just didn't seem to work. All the traditional parenting strategies that I read in books or friends and family told me, they didn't help. In fact, they'd often make it worse. I remember this one time when my daughter was having this meltdown and a family member said, "Why don't you just give her a hug?" But I knew that actually hugging her could escalate it even further. And I didn't understand why, I just knew that happened. I do now know, and I will explain why later. But this whole scenario made me feel so helpless, like I was a terrible parent, and I just didn't know what to do. Well, in this week's episode, I'm going to tell you what you can do because there are some strategies that work with our children. But we do need to use these different strategies because our kids are differently wired and we have to work with their brains and their bodies in a way that helps them rather than just trying to hit them over the head with these traditional strategies that just are hopeless, basically. So I have a workshop coming up called Managing Meltdowns, and I have a link to that in the video description or the show notes if you're listening on the podcast. And we can go really in depth on these strategies. It's a 2-hour long workshop and we'll be able to really dig into the techniques that will help your child. But what I want to do today is just give you a little bit of a sneak peek of that so you can try some of these out at home, and if you are finding that they're helping, sign up to the workshop and let's go deeper. So I'm going to start with sensory regulation. Now, when I discovered about the sensory system and how some children have problems processing their senses and become really dysregulated, this was when things really changed for us. Now, if you're anything like I was in the beginning, you think senses are just sight, sound, smell, that kind of thing, and that's probably your entire knowledge of the sensory system. In fact, we have a wide range of sensories, including things like vestibular, which is movement, and proprioception, which is the communication between our joints and muscles, and interoception, which manages emotional regulation, amongst other things like your body temperature. And for some children, this can get really wildly dysregulated. Now, all of us have a tendency to be either hyper or hyposensitive. So hypo is under responsive, hypo is obviously over responsive to different senses. So for example, with myself, I have a little bit of hypersensitivity around vestibular, so that's movement. I can't tolerate fairground rides. I don't like being in a car travelling really fast, and I can't sit on a swing with my daughter. Now, it's not bad enough that it's really disrupting my life. It's a little bit of an inconvenience, but it's not really a big deal. But for some of our children, it is a very big deal because it is disrupting their ability to manage everyday tasks. For example, being in the school environment, being in a shopping centre, going to birthday parties. but we can help them regulate their sensory system. And we need to do that because this is one of the key factors that leads to meltdowns. So if we can implement some strategies that's helping them regulate their sensory system, then we are staving off those meltdowns. So one thing you might want to consider is creating a sensory den in your home. This will help when they come out of environments that we have less control over, such as schools, nurseries, shopping centres, where they may be getting really dysregulated by the levels of noise, the brightness of the lights, all sorts of different things in these environments can create a problem with their sensory system. So when we bring them home, what we want to do is create a calming home environment for them, and we can do this by creating a little sensory den. You can pick up a little tent for as little as £10 from places like Argos or IKEA. If your child has significant sensory issues, particularly around light, you might want to splash out a bit more and get a blackout tent. You can find these all over the places. They are a little bit on the pricey side, but they are really effective. Now in that den you want to have things that's going to help calm them, so maybe some sensory toys like fidgets, Nidos, kind of things that will give them push and pull and tactile sensitivity if that's what they need. You also might want to have a snack ready for them. Things like bagels are good because they're really chewy. Also things like a smoothie to drink through a straw. Sucking something thick through a straw is very good for calming our sensory system, calming our emotional regulation. There are two more things. They're a little bit controversial, but I'm going to mention them anyway because it's down to personal choice. McDonald's thick shakes and chewing gum. Both of these help with sensory regulation. Total personal choice whether you decide to go down that route. Now, another area of sensory regulation that your child may struggle with is needing lots of movement. That was the case for my daughter. She is always on the go, and when she's not getting that proper movement, when she's been made to sit in the classroom for too long, she gets very dysregulated. So something I used to do was factor in a quick trip to the park on the way home. Now, I would avoid the tendency to think that I'm going to wear them out by lots of exercise so then they'll sleep well. That can massively backfire with our kids and can actually lead to a meltdown. So what we want to do is short bursts frequently. So I might take my daughter to the park for just 20 minutes and stick her on the swing, and then we go home. Now, if I didn't think she was in the right emotional state to go to the park, there's obviously lots of children, lots of noise, and maybe she couldn't cope with that. I would bring her home and we had a hammock set up at home. Hammocks are great because you get that movement by swinging. You're also getting proprioception, that's the joints and muscles, because it's tight around your body and it's encasing you. It's actually giving quite a womb-like feeling. And she would actually pull it all the way over her face to block out the light because she has visual sensitivity. So she was getting movement, visual and proprioception regulation from being in that hammock. And I remember in lockdown we used to spend hours in the hammock because it was really helping her when she couldn't access other forms of sensory regulation. Now she's a bit older, she's less keen on going to parks. I do other things. She loves climbing, and we're very fortunate in that we have a climbing centre quite near her school. So after she comes out of school, she's normally like, "Arr!" and I take her to the climbing centre. Within 10 minutes, I would say she's calmed down massively because she's getting that proprioception input. So these are some things that you can think about. There are a range of different types of sensory input, and your child can be hyper and hypo in different areas. As I said on that workshop, that we will go into this in much more depth, but maybe start exploring some of these ideas at home. Create that calming environment away from environments that we can't control so easily. So the next thing I want you to try is to create a low demand parenting approach. Now this is quite a step away from traditional parenting strategies, and some parents really struggle with it because they feel like they're letting their kids get away with it, but they're not. What we're doing is reducing demands in order to reduce meltdowns. Now I use a strategy in NVR, that's non-violent resistance. And this is a type of parenting approach. I describe it as like Martin Luther King on the school run, because it is taken from the principles of some of those civil rights leaders, where they learned, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, what they learned through their activism was that when we meet violence and aggression with active passive resistance, we often get further than meeting it head on with other violence. So violence meeting violence often just leads to more violence. But when we meet things with active passive resistance, we get change. And this is not the same as letting them get away with it. It's about building relationships. It's about working with where they are at the moment. Now, low demand parenting is a way that we can take the pressures off our kids who are already dealing with so much by being a neurodivergent child in a neurotypical world. And in NVR, we have a really simple way of doing this. So what I want you to do is you can pause this for a moment if you want and get a pen and paper. And I want you to write down every challenging behaviour that your child has, from the violence, if they have it, to the won't tidy their room. All the things that you annoy you, upset you, make you worried. I want you to write them all down. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to break these into 3 groups. We call these baskets. So we're kind of using the symbolism of a basket. We have a red basket, an amber basket, and a green basket. Now, in that red basket, we put the most challenging behaviours. If your child is displaying any kind of violent and aggressive behaviours, either towards themselves or to others, this goes in your red basket. Absolutely no question. We have to deal with this. We can't let that one go. And then you can have maybe one more, but that's it. You're not putting anything else in that red basket. So what we're doing is we're only dealing with these issues. Now, in the amber basket, we're putting all those behaviours that we don't like, but they're not as serious as the red basket issues. And you can have in this 2 or 3. So that might be things like swearing, lying, not looking after themselves, not brushing their teeth, not washing, all these things that they are important. We're not saying that they're not important, but we're not going to deal with them until we've dealt with the red basket things. We absolutely will deal with them when we've dealt with the red basket things and they're out of the basket and they're not a feature of our life anymore. We move something up from the amber basket into the red basket, and then we start dealing with it. Because if you try and deal with all these things at once, you are going to get overwhelmed, your child is going to get overwhelmed, and you're just going to have even more meltdowns. Now, in the green basket, we put absolutely everything else and we just let it go. I used to sing that song from Frozen in my head constantly when my daughter was doing something that was really winding me up, but I knew it was in my green basket. I would just sing Let It Go in my head. And it does take a change in perception to deal with this in this way. But I promise you, this had a massive impact on the number of meltdowns that my daughter was having, because I just lifted all these demands and I stopped escalating situations when I just let it go. So try the baskets. It's a really popular part of NVR and I think you'll really like it. Now, the third thing that I want you to think about is your own self-care, because the quickest way to escalate a child into a meltdown is if we're not emotionally regulated. And I want you to start being quite mindful of your own emotional regulation. So when you see them working up, how are you feeling inside your body? What is going on for you? And there are some simple things that we can do to help calm ourselves so that when our child is getting really dysregulated, we're not going with them. We're stepping back, we're remaining calm, we're being a solid foundation for them. Now, one technique I like is a breathing technique called 4-7-8. And the way that this works is that we breathe in for 4, we breathe out for, we hold it for 7, and we breathe out for 8. And this is something that you can just do quietly in a corner while your child is just winding themselves up, just to calm yourself down so that you are not going along into the meltdown with them. But we do need to have a regular self-care strategy as well. It needs to be part of your daily routine. And for this, I would recommend tapping. Tapping is a form of talk therapy combined with acupuncture, where we tap on various parts of the body. It's basically where we would put the needles if we were doing acupuncture, while reciting some statements about the way we are feeling. Now, I know this sounds really quirky and a bit odd, but bear with me because this is such a powerful technique. You don't need to pay an expensive professional. You don't need any fancy equipment. You can do it in as little as 10 minutes in your own home. And you can build it into your daily routine. So for example, maybe when you get up in the morning, or maybe before you go and do the school run, you can do some tapping. Now, as I said, I know it sounds really kooky and you might be thinking, what the hell is this? I'm not doing that. What I'd like you to ask is just give you a try. And you can do this by downloading some free resources, which I have in the video description or the podcast show notes. This is a free guided tapping meditation. It takes less than 10 minutes and you will feel the results instantly. So give it a go, and if it's useful, keep doing it. So those are the 3 strategies that I would recommend. But what I haven't talked about is what you do when the meltdown is actually happening. And that is because, unfortunately, there's not much you can do other than keep yourself safe and keep your child safe. Now, if your child is prone to violence during their meltdowns, one thing you might want to invest in is one of those really big cushions. And when you see them working themselves up, you say, is this a big cushion moment? Because then you can grab the cushion and put it in front of you to protect yourself. So if they are hitting and kicking, you're not going to get hurt, but you're still staying with them. Now, my daughter did tend to lash out like that, and what I would often do was just move back a little bit. I wouldn't leave the room, but I would say to her, I need to keep myself safe here, and everyone in this house has a right to be free from violence, and I'm not going to tolerate being hit, because this is one of the things in the red basket, right? So we are dealing with that, but we're just doing it in a calm and firm way. So you move back. I'd often stand on the edge of the door. She'd often tell me to go away, but I was worried about if I actually left the room, she might hurt herself. And I know some of you will have children who might smash up a room or do some things really drastic if you left them alone, but you could maybe just stand in the doorway, do your breathing and keep yourself calm as possible and just wait for it to be over. Now, some of you will need to step in a bit more. Now, I don't advocate any kind of hold or restraint. Don't think it's an effective way to deal with that unless your child is posing a danger to themselves. Then you may need to step in. But otherwise, we step back and we shut the hell up. Because actually, the other thing that I found was that talking could actually activate my daughter, because we're going back to the sensory system here. She has auditory sensitivity, and because she was often in a state of sensory dysregulation, talking would just trigger her again. And I mentioned before about hugging. So people often say, just hug them, hold them, whatever. And this is also why I don't recommend any kind of physical restraint either, because if you have a child who has tactile sensitivity, that's just going to escalate them as well. So stand back, keep quiet, and wait for it to be over. But if you use the 3 other techniques that I mentioned before, you should start to see a reduction in the number of meltdowns that you are experiencing. So you won't have to just sit through these meltdowns so much. So just to go over those again, that's managing the sensory system by creating a calm and sensory regulatory environment in your home. It's creating a low demand parenting approach by using the NVR baskets, and it's managing your self-care through breath work and techniques such as tapping. So as I said, let's go deeper on this. If it sounds good, if you've tried these things out and they're working, let's go deeper. Sign up to that workshop through the link. and I would really love to help you get on top of these meltdowns and be in a place where I now am, in that meltdowns are such a rarity, and they're rare because I use these strategies. So my daughter is kind of living proof that this works. So that's it for this week. If you have enjoyed this show, please give it a rating and a review. This really helps the algorithm, and that enables other parents to find it. So by giving it a rating and review, you are giving something back to other families who are stuck in frustration and isolation. So thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. I hope you found that video useful. If you would like to go a little bit more in depth on those baskets, you might like this video here. This goes into more detail on the low demand parenting approach, so give it a watch.